Alvarado to let you all know who are those winners. So have a good evening and thank you for joining.
Thank you, Alejandro. Good evening, families, parents, caregivers, community partners, and staff. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I wanted to just pop in and say quickly on behalf of the Office of Family and Community Partnerships and Chief Blackberg, welcome to all of our SGCs, our SGC members, to your second training for the school year 2021-2022. And I also wanted to remind you all what a key factor you are in all of our planning. Thank you so much for your voice. Thank you for your feedback. And now I would like to welcome to our virtual stage, right? Superintendent Dr. Leslie Torres Rodriguez and our Chief Financial Officer, Philip Penn.
Good evening, everyone. So good to be with you. And Chief Penn is also here joining us. And Chief Penn and I are gonna kind of go back and forth in terms of the presentation. And before we dive in, I actually I'm going to ask anyone else from our team to just kind of go off camera and just say hello to everyone that's joining us.
Good evening, John Fergus, Director of Communications.
Okay, team, we can get going. Just checking, Viviana, are you going to review, or Mr. Martinez, the instructions for how to access Spanish interpretation? If not, I can certainly do that.
I got it. Yep. No worries. So I know this slide by heart now. If you are looking into accessing our interpretation channel for the Spanish version, our amazing interpreter is right now live interpreting this presentation. All you have to do is go at the bottom of your screen. There is a little symbol that looks like a globe, the old internet symbol. You click on that. There'll be two options, one that says English, one that says Spanish. Click on the Spanish one. If you would like to absolutely not hear the original presenter, you can choose to mute your original audio. That's what it'll do. Si usted necesita accesar la interpretación en español, ahora mismo nuestra intérprete Lady Ann está interpretando esta presentación en español. Lo que usted debe hacer es ir a la parte de abajo de su pantalla de Zoom y usted va a ver un simbolito como un globo terráqueo, que era como el que se usaba para el internet antes. Usted le da clic a eso y va a ver dos opciones, una que dice audio en inglés y otra que dice español. Le da clic a la de audio en español. Y si usted quiere no escuchar para nada el audio original o el audio en inglés, le da mute al audio original y así solamente va a estar escuchando a Lady Ann y va a poder ver la presentación.
Thank you, Ms. Alvarado, and we will jump right into our presentation. The goals for tonight and for our learning. It is very important for us that you all understand the budget process and that we continue to have transparency into the budget development process and how actually it's all impacted by what we call the larger fiscal context. That's a fancy way of saying everything else that is happening with finances now and then also into the future. So for today, we're going to look at the current state of funding for Hartford Public Schools and specifically what has our past financial situation has been and how the federal stimulus dollars play a role into our financial outlook. Federal stimulus funding, if some of you recall, are the relief funding that we got both from state and federal to develop a recovery plan given the pandemic. We also are going to talk about how money is allocated to schools and the actual process of developing a budget and who makes decisions, what roles do each of us play in that, and then of course what the timeline is, given that that is going to look a little bit different in terms of a timeline than it did in the past. The resources that we have, and when we use the word resources, we're talking about people, right? The staff, the time, how we all use the time, how school schedules come about, and then the money, the investments that we make. So our resources are allocated, as you can see, in alignment with our district model of excellence, the strategic plan, which many of you informed in the spring when we developed the plan, and all of that is grounded in our mission, because we want to make sure that we continue to provide our students with the learning and the supports that they need to be successful, not only when they're with us in school, but of course, outside of school and later in life. And we want to make sure that at the end of it all, that students graduate ready to transform our world. And the priorities remain the same, making sure that every single classroom has there's high quality teaching and learning, that we continue to create a culture and a climate in our schools, in all of our spaces in Hartford Public Schools that are welcoming, and that we continue to engage our families, caregivers, and our community partners in that process. And that we do ensure that all of our staff have the knowledge, the skills, and the disposition that they need. And then we operate in the most effective and efficient way so that we can be as smart as we can with all of the resources that we have to improve student outcomes. So the current funding picture for Hartford Public Schools, I'm going to tag Chief Penn to give us an overview.
Thanks, Superintendent. So let me give you a little bit of background around our revenue. So revenue are dollars that are coming into the school district. And if you look over the last 4 years, you'll notice that the total amount of dollars that we've received has been relatively flat. There's a little bit higher percentage in what comes to us from the state, particularly on a per pupil basis. There's a little bit less that comes to us in terms of federal dollars. Local dollars of about 280 some odd million includes the state's ECS grant, education cost sharing. That's the primary vehicle that the state uses to fund local and municipal governments for education. So relatively flat growth in our revenue is a problem for us in terms of inflation, right? When you think about average inflation over the last 10 years has been somewhere around 2 or 3%. On a budget of more than $400 million, 2 or 3% inflation means we need to generate roughly $12 million more in revenue per year just to stay current with our growth and expenses. As we'll see on the next slide, thank you. We've managed to do that by maintaining, through good cost controls, our expenditures have been below our revenues, and we're required by state law to do that. We cannot end the year in a deficit. And so there's been a lot of work done over the last several years to take cost out of the system to make sure that what we expend, what our total costs are, stays below what we receive for revenue. And I'll turn it back over to the superintendent to talk about what's happened historically.
So I can give an example, and this is in the next slide, a visual that I continue to kind of thread through all of the budget seasons. And we've been in a cycle of budget deficit mitigations each year up until the pandemic. I mean, it started when we had to do the hard work of consolidating some of our schools and trying to see if there were efficiencies there. And as you can see here, if you look across, The increase in vacancies and other small savings that we got from remote and hybrid learning have kind of given us a breather, if you will, in terms of not having to reduce the same amount of positions. But you see here over the years, if you go down to where it says schools and you look across, right, over the years, we've had to reduce a total of 300 positions. And at the central office level, a total of, over 80 positions. And, we know that we did get this influx of federal stimulus funding, and that's great for us. But as we look ahead into future years, we know that we will very likely be in the similar position that we were, which is what we're looking at now, right? Having to deal with costs continuing to outpace the money that is coming in. So we are again going to be forced with making tough decisions. But in a few slides ahead, we'll explain to you what it is that we're hoping to do to kind of not get us to that space again. In the next slide, one other piece that's important for us to consider here is the enrollment decline, which is a big contributor in having that stagnant revenue that Chief Penn was explaining a few slides before, right? This is a trend in terms of enrollment that has been exacerbated by the pandemic. And because the enrollment is spread across schools, that means that there are 20 students here, 40 students in another school. We have 39 schools. It would be very different if, the reduction in enrollment were in one school, but it's because it's across all schools. It just makes it a little more challenging for us in terms of adjusting our funding in response to the loss. And it's really hard to do that, especially in the short term. And it still remains a major piece of our financial picture. And I know that, in speaking to and looking at the numbers with Chief Penn, you see the projection. And if I get it correctly, Chief Penn, you were saying that we're still off in terms of the projection.
That's right. The same model that generated the estimate of 17,400 had us at almost 17,500 for 21-22. So we know there's some risk in that 22-23 estimate right now.
And then in our next slide, so we talked about where we were and what are some of the challenges that we've had in the past, what we've done about that example, having to reduce the positions throughout the years. We also talked about the decline in enrollment. And now I want to talk about, in terms of the next couple of years. We know that over the next 3 years, we have had, we're going to have this unprecedented influx of federal stimulus. Many of you participated in feedback that informed the plan. We submitted the application. It was reviewed and approved at the state and federal level. And yes, this gives us much needed resources to accelerate social, emotional, academic recovery efforts that we know were impacted as a result of the pandemic. And we also have to think about, how do we sustain some of those investments that we're making now? In our next slide, this is a visual that some of you might remember. Just as our general fund dollars are focused on resourcing our strategic plan and the initiatives, also our stimulus dollars, they were very intentionally aligned to accelerate specific areas that we heard from many of you. We heard from our staff, from our teachers, from our families, from our students about what it is that we needed in order to support with the recovery, right? So those 50 hours of stakeholder engagement, after looking at all of that, we were able to identify the what we call the must-win areas. And so, those $144 million, yes, they've been identified and aligned to these areas. And we want to think about how can we continue to support with additional mental health resources and services. after the money dries up? How can we continue to have a strong teacher pipeline, right? Because we know we want to continue to attract and retain our teachers. And so now we go and we move on to Chief Penn talking about what is it looking then moving forward?
So as we've developed the ESSER 2 and the ARP COVID-related relief budgets over the last, say, 6 or 9 months, you may have heard the term fiscal cliff come up quite a bit. And when we talk about a fiscal cliff, this is actually what we're referring to. 3 years from now, the funding that we're receiving from the federal government for COVID relief is going to go away. But the underlying cost drivers that we have in the district, the inflation that I talked about earlier, is still going to be present and still going to be there. And in addition to that, we're doing some new things within this ARP and ESSER spending that we're probably going to want to continue going forward. So the question then becomes, well, what are you doing about it now that you can see the train on the tracks 3 years away before the train actually gets here? And we can start talking about that a little bit on the next slide. So I'm heading up along with ERS, our external partners, and a number of other folks, a project around what we're calling financial sustainability. So financial sustainability, the way we've defined it within the project, is that the rate of growth of our revenue is equal to or greater than the rate of growth of our expenses. Therefore, we're growing in line with each other. So one of the things that we're looking at as we develop a cost model that goes out to 2030 is looking at what would it look like with all of our bargaining contracts updated? How real is the enrollment decline and how long is that going to be persistent going forward? And what are the potential implications of CHEF and that litigation as we look down the future? Even though we may have fewer students, the needs of those students are continuing to increase, both in terms of special education, our multilingual learners, and the chronic absenteeism we face as a district. So what are the ways that we can leverage the money that we have right now to offset some of those future costs? And how do we think about the labor market as a whole as well? We know we have a number of vacancies around the district, and our head of OTM is working extremely hard with her and her team to address some of that. But are there systemic shifts in the labor force that we need to be thinking about as we think about a long-term vision for the financial sustainability of the district? Next slide, please. So what are the other cost drivers that we need to take a very close look at because they make up such a huge portion of our budget? Increasing tuition costs for MANA programs that are not our own, the rising costs for special education, both internally and for our outplacements, the declining in-district enrollment, and that becomes really important for our federal entitlement grants since they're tied directly to our enrollment levels, and rising costs overall. You know, I mentioned a 2 to 3% increase in inflation being the historical level, but if you've been paying attention to the news recently, inflation's running closer to 4 or 5% right now. How long will that be sustainable coming out of a pandemic? You know, are we going to continue to see that type of an increase going forward for what is more than a short-term period? Next slide. So one of the things we're very committed to is making sure that we have stakeholder engagement throughout this fiscal sustainability project. The first big wave of that comes on December 15th when we go and present sort of our initial findings to the Board of Finance, the Board of Education's Finance Committee. We're going to have a public hearing on both the budget and our fiscal outlook during the month of January. And I won't read everything else on the list, but you'll see how we engage with teachers, how we engage with principals, our student and family focus groups, another review with the board in the February to March timeframe, discussing with union leadership. And hopefully by the time we get out to April, we've got some concrete plans about what we can do differently going forward that says, yes, we actually really are committed to fiscal sustainability and making sure that the long term for the district doesn't have us in the cycle of constantly trying to cut $15 to $20 million out of our budget every year. That's not a productive exercise for anybody, and it's certainly not good for our kids. Next slide, please.
So in terms of the development process, I'll kind of, again, go back to a little historical perspective, and then Chief Penn, I'll tag you in to talk about what does it look like now. So in our next slide, so some of you might remember, or school leaders might remember, that several years ago, we tried to really understand how to improve what you all thought how we should improve are two things: budget development process and funding, because we know that we kept hearing about some inequities in terms of how schools were funded. And so we did a lot of engagement with all of our groups, and we heard several themes. The themes are on this table to the left, right? We heard that people wanted transparency, and that meant that schools wanted to understand, schools and SGCs wanted to understand exactly the resources and how resources were allocated, and where money comes from, the state, the federal level. How does all that play into the budget process? And we want to make sure that over the years we achieved clarifying that. So we made publicly available the formula for allocating the resources to the schools. We'll do that again today. Another thing that we heard was equity. We kept hearing that, why some schools, get more resources than others, especially when some schools needed more resources than others. So again, we went back and we identified how we allocate the resources based on very specific needs that students in some schools have. And now that we have the additional funding, we did the same thing, right? We looked at our recovery funds, and we identified which schools, which grade levels would need or would require additional funding, and having clarity around that so that we can get at the equity. Stability is something that we didn't hear it that much, but that was something that I added because, as Chief Penn said, there's a certain amount of money, right? There's a bucket of money, if you will. And we have to make sure that we get creative as to how do we allocate those resources. But if we knew that some schools were getting more than others, we also didn't want to destabilize some schools that were used to receiving a certain amount of resources. And so I wanted to make sure that we kept stability there so that if we had to shift some of the resources, it wouldn't be completely removing what schools were had planned for. And so we still are having an example of that is a magnet supplement that is in the formula. Flexibility, this is something we heard from our school leaders. School leaders wanted to know specifically how much money they had for flexible dollars and what they could use the flexible dollars for. And then timeliness is many felt that we were very late in our process. Compared to other districts, we were very late. I mean, I remember the year that our budget was not passed until June. I realized that, sometimes it is pending on whether the state and the governor's office, passes their budget. But nonetheless, waiting until late spring or till the end of the school year causes us to miss out on an opportunity to hire good talent in terms of teachers, specifically teachers. And then the last thing that we heard, this one actually came up from many different groups, was strategic alignment. Folks, stakeholders felt that it wasn't really clear what we were prioritizing in terms of the strategies and what it is that we wanted to really focus on from the resource perspective. And so we now wanted to move forward with the process that we were very clear about what the priorities and the strategies were. And I think that this year, more than ever, we have a very clear understanding what our strategies are moving forward. So given that historical context, now that we have this 1-year budget. Yes, we understand that this is for the 2022-2023 year. However, we want to focus, yes, now for the 1-year budget, but also focus on long-term outcomes. And so there are those three, some of the themes from the previous slide are important now again. And, stability, we want to make sure that we continue to use the equity-based funding as like that foundational element of the budget. And we also want to have strong alignment to our priorities and our strategic plan. We want to keep it simple. We want to, have tools and processes. And then we also want to make sure that it's transparent, right? That everyone is clear what the formulas are. And of course, right, the big work that we're trying to lift is the sustainability, right? How can we ensure that the student-based programs that are grounded in research and best practice can continue after 1 year? How can we ensure that we are in the best position possible to recruit, not only at the state, but even across state lines? How do we recruit and retain talent? Of course, fiscal sustainability, which is what Chief Penn was talking about. We want to avoid falling from that, right? That cliff, that financial cliff. And how do we make the decisions, yes, for 1 year, but making sure that we're not sacrificing what it is that we want to do long-term. So I know, Chief Penn, that's a tall order, but that is what we're going to aim to do. In the next slide, please.
Yeah. So that's exactly right. It is a tall order, but just to echo a couple of the points that the superintendent made, we're accelerating this process really to create competitive advantage for the school district, particularly relates to hiring. There's something like 19 school districts that are in a 15-mile radius of Hartford, and we're all competing for that local talent. And across the state, there's 145 school districts that we're all competing against that same pool of talent. And so frankly, the earlier that we are clear about what our hiring needs for the upcoming school year, the earlier we can go out and post for those positions and hopefully obtain that talent and bring them here to Hartford. And we're working on a number of different things with the posting process, with the internal processes as part of our ongoing discussions with union leadership around making sure that those changes are in place for the upcoming year. And we're also adopting AlloView, and AlloView is just something that is a tool that sits on top of Munis, which is our accounting software, that I think will give a lot more clarity into how budgets get created, give a lot more clarity in terms of seeing how the budget is being spent through the year through dashboards and things of that nature. So internally, we went through training on AlloView about this time a month ago. And we want to make sure that AlloView is going to be accessible to all the SGCs going forward. And we're working through exactly how to do that by collecting names and email addresses of the SGC chairs to make sure they're permissioned into the system so they have the same level of access to seeing data that we do internally here. So if we can roll on to the next slide. And as the superintendent mentioned, this is a big complex organization, right? There are a number of key stakeholders in this process. Central office certainly, but our school leadership and our school governance councils are going to have a big part in this process. Our community members outside of those groups will also have a say in sort of how this works. And then our board members, of course, who ultimately will be the ones that vote on and adopt the budget. And you'll see in a few slides here that we're targeting that process for the middle of February to have definitive views on where we are. So in thinking about a budget process, and I'm going to say this up front, this is going to feel compressed, and we recognize that. My group is going to feel that as well as we try to get through this, but please think of it in the context of creating that competitive advantage. So that red line, that arrow, you are here. We are very early in the stages of starting this process. We're going to releasing the budgets to the schools. We'll make sure the SGCs have access to that information as well. We'll run through the process of doing the initial phase of the budget through December 6th. And that's where we're going to be looking for the first sign off from the SGCs that they've had an opportunity to discuss the budgets with school leadership. And then we'll ask them that it all gets submitted to my department around December 6th so that we can then do some internal reviews of those budgets and start doing cross-functional reviews amongst the different departments in central office that have impact on all the schools. We'll do another community forum just to give an update on where we are in the process on December 8th. we're going to ask, and this is the tough time frame, for a second review with the school governance councils in sort of mid-December. We know that's a tough time frame, but we want to make sure if there are any adjustments that get made out of those cross-functional reviews or internal review, if we find an error, that there's an opportunity to come back and make sure that the SGCs were aware of that change before it went to the board in January. So we'll review internally strategic investments and potentially disinvestments around mid-December. If we could roll to the next slide, please. We'll get that final sign off. We'll then start the internal process of making sure that everything rolls up at a district level to something that fits what we think the revenues are going to be. And our revenue assumptions going into next year is that we're flat compared to where we are this year. If there are any early wins from that financial sustainability project, we'll make sure that those are captured in the budget as well, with a look to delivering a first draft of the budget to the superintendent for her review around January 6th. We'll then have an opportunity to present the budget to the Finance Committee of the Board of Education around January 18th. That's another key date for us. We'll do a full budget workshop with the Board of Education sometime in late January. Any revisions that come out of that workshop will then get incorporated into the budget with a view of then having a public hearing on that budget somewhere in the late January timeframe as well. And then finally, as I mentioned, we're really trying to target toward that February 15th date to be completed with the budget process that will then allow us to identify what roles do we need that we don't have today. And we'll start getting some postings up to make sure we can attract some talent as a result of this. So overall, you're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of about a 3.5 month process from the beginning to end. And as I said at the beginning, we know that that's compressed. You know, most school districts are used to seeing a budget for time frame that usually runs 5 or 6 months. But we're trying something different here now in a way that I think will greatly benefit the district over the long term. And if we could roll on the next slide, please. So what do the school budgets look like and what kind of flexibilities do we have? Next slide. Okay. So this is the basic funding model for all of the schools. This is something that was developed about 1.5 years ago, but was not implemented last year due to the pandemic. So there's nothing that's really changed in this formula from where it was first presented 18 months ago. And you'll see, and I'm not going to read every element on this slide, but you get a sense for, you know, what are the boundaries around what point you add staff onto the budget? What are the boundaries in terms of like what you estimate for school supplies on a per pupil basis? What are the activity stipends for teachers paid on a per pupil basis? If we can roll to the next one. You know, and then we're looking at the equity-based piece of this, where we've identified particular needs inside some of the schools in terms of multilingual learners, you know, making sure that we have some additional resources available for them, making sure that we have a student engagement specialist when we know we have schools that we have outliers in terms of chronically absent students within that school. We want to make sure we're addressing those. You'll see what we added into this process for SEL from the middle school activities, the managed supplement that the superintendent had talked about a little bit earlier. And then flexible dollars, you know, what really is sitting at the discretion of the principal working in conjunction with the school governance councils to figure out at that local level, at that school level, what is best needed to address the needs of students within that building. I, as a CFO, can't determine that. That's not my place to do that. You folks, as part of the SGCs and the principals, are the ones that are closest to those students and can identify better than I can what it needs to be rolled up into that budget. And that's where those flexible dollars are going to come into play. Next slide, please. So what could potentially change, right? A drastic shift in enrollment, which I don't think is going to be the case. I think we're pretty well dialed in on where we are for right now for enrollment. We have a pretty good view for where we're going for next year. We're pretty well dialed in on the district model for excellence. You know, we want to make sure every of the spends that we're doing are aligned with that. I think we've done a relatively good job, particularly with the additional federal dollars that we've received for ESSER. Resource availability. This is probably the one that may come into play, right? Right now, we're something like 550 days out from the end of the 22-23 school year. So we're trying to make our best estimates around where we think our revenues are going to fall. Some of those grants are going to come in a little bit higher. Some of those grants are going to come in lower. We recognize that. So if there's a major shift in our resource availability, we may have to go back to the model and tweak it somewhat to make sure it all fits in. And then ESSER funds we've talked about are sort of outside of the funding process for the budget, because we've actually addressed that through two other means, as we went along, and we had the ESSER 2 funds come up and layered on the ARP funds that the superintendent went through a little while ago. So that's really kind of living on its own outside of the scope of what we want to call the kind of the core budget going forward. Next slide. So just kind of keeping in mind, there are also central office expenditures that take place outside of the schools that also support the schools. You'll see the list here. These are things that we budget at a central office level to make sure that it's not subject to any kind of shifts in the school populations, and to make sure that everybody's resourced appropriately when it comes to making sure we have special social workers and special education teachers and things along those lines. So, even though these are budgeted centrally, they do directly support the services that are in schools. So we are going to continue that practice going forward. Next slide. So just to reiterate something that the superintendent said earlier, just kind of keep in mind that equitable doesn't always mean equal, right? So if you look at two schools that are relatively similar size, you start asking yourselves questions like, well, why are their discretionary dollars 600,000 and our discretionary dollars only 450? Remember that what we're trying to do with this model now is making sure that we align the precious resources that we have against the student needs that we identify. And so if we're successful with that, I think we will be, this is kind of a model to use going forward. And it's just something to keep considering, as you identify the needs within your own buildings, make sure that you're incorporating that into the budgets you're creating in conjunction with your principals, so they get submitted in as part of the overall budget process. And before we continue on to the next one, I just want to acknowledge the fact that there's over 110 people on the call tonight. That's just a fantastic level of participation. And I'm not used to seeing that as a CFO where I've been prior to this. So it's really nice to see that we've got that many people engaged around the budgetary process. I'm much more used to speaking to empty rooms. So it's kind of nice to have people on board with, recognizing that this is important. Next slide. And I think with that, the superintendent and I will be happy to take any questions you have.
And Chief Penn, before we open it up for questions, I wanted to add that if you go to slides 25 and 26, the actual starter budget, this would be year 4. The challenge is that year 1 and year 2, we were fine. We learned this new process. Year 3 was last year, right? The pandemic. And so I made a decision to, for example, not shift resources, even though, enrollment declined significantly. I think do you have those numbers? I mean, I thought it was close to 1,000 in terms of the difference from what was projected. And, that would have translated into, having to reduce close to like 40 teachers. And I did not want to lay anyone off right in the middle of a pandemic. And so, that was a decision that we made. And so we didn't implement the budget formula, but we are, doing so moving forward. So I just wanted to offer that piece of history there. So I think I'm going to turn it over back to the team for questions.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Torres Rodriguez and Chief Penn. I do want to acknowledge the engagement that we've been having this year. In lieu of Family Engagement Month, I have to come in and say something, right? From the Office of Family and Community Partnerships. So thank you. Engagement this year has been amazing. I just want to highlight that Beverly said change has arrived in all caps. So that is always good to see. It's always amazing to hear that our partners, our families, our stakeholders are seeing the change. It's always nice. So somebody did ask, and Dr. Torres Rodriguez, you did mention that yes, the presentation will be available. So that was a question that we had. And then another question is, in terms of the budget shared by the school, right, by the admin, will it only be shared with SGCs, or will the school community have access to it as well? Is this something that, the principal will say, hey, we shared this budget with the SGC, here's what we're working on? Or is this just for SGCs?
Chief Avila, I believe, is on the call. I just want to make sure that I know that trying to think of my days as a principal and working with my SUC. I know that I would share minutes from the meetings,
Right.
but that was a long time ago. Chief Avila.
No, it wasn't.
Good evening, everyone, and good evening, Dr. Torres Rodriguez. So what principals will do, often they would like to have a meeting with the SGC and also have the opportunity to share it with the entire PTO, the parent-teacher organization, so that everyone knows, and to have a general meeting so that the whole school body has an opportunity to understand what's happening with the budget and to hear the feedback from all families.
Awesome. Thank you, Chief Avila. And then we have a question on our Q&A option, and it goes, do you make any special considerations for needs of different types of schools? And I know you touched base on this when you talked about stability, but like as an example, they mentioned Renzulli Academy has 9 teachers and 130 kids. No outside space for the kids to go to except for a classroom created by our art teacher, Miss O.
Yes, that was it was sort of a question that we got this morning when we had a presentation with principals. Those are, going to be looked at on an individual basis. I know that we had a question earlier this morning about the I believe it was social emotional needs. Now that, they have increased. And so, what would that look like? And, a specific question from a principal about, I believe a higher level of need. And, if we look at the slide, that's here, is it that it's a certain amount, right? Because we can see, that's not the good slide. The good example. If you go to the previous slide, just so that I can highlight, I believe, if I recall correctly, it was probably around a social worker, right? That it says, 1 social worker per 325 students. And the principal said to us, well, that need can be different and can be felt differently in one school versus in another school. So we want to look at those individually, right? Always thinking about the fact that, right, there's a fixed amount of money, but how do we step back and really look at the equity and the need? And also the good part this year is that we're also able to think about the additional resources that we have through ESSER and ARP, right? The question this morning was about social workers, and we know that we added 20 additional social workers this year through ESSER funding. So we're going to actually look at it from 2 different angles, but that's a great question.
Thank you. And then will schools follow up with budget information? We know you all mentioned a timeline, and there's 2 different sign-off forms, and there's the first one, and then there's the feedback. Will this information also be shared as it is updated by the schools?
No, I'm not sure I understand which information.
So
maybe you
he was nodding. He was like, yes.
Oh, okay.
So right. So when the school or the admins meet with the SGC, here is our proposed budget. Then it's revised, right? Chief Avila mentioned that, yes, then the PTO, everybody will be involved. Will there be a second a follow-up, right? Like SGC provided feedback, this is what we're going with. Will that be also shared?
Yeah, that's right. You know, when we get to that second process, after we've sort of gone through things at central office and we've had that opportunity for the cross-functional reviews, any kind of changes would then go back to the schools, and that's the opportunity in that second review for the SGCs and the school community to be aware of any changes that got made. And then my hope is when we get to the end of the process, after the budget's adopted, we'll load the actual budget up into Allaview so that the SGCs and the school community more broadly can actually see what's made it into the final budget as it was adopted by the board. So that it becomes then our tracking mechanism going forward as we actually start spending the money July 1st of next year.
Awesome, thank you. And then we have one on our Q&A. In schools that are getting new enrollments from ESL students, could the budget be adjusted to cover the students' necessities?
Yeah, absolutely. The answer to that is, you know, that we recognize that budgets are not cookie cutter. You know, we understand that there's going to be changing need as things evolve. And even as we begin a school year, you know, we recognize that things shift during the year. And as a result of that, we need to shift it too, to make sure that we have resources in the right place as things change. You know, as I mentioned, we're developing this budget really 14 months before the timeframe of when that budget is supposed to be expended. We know things are going to change over that time. And this is something that becomes an ongoing challenge for us at central office, is making sure that we have the ability to shift around resources as needs emerge during the year.
Thank you, Chief Penn. So far, those are all the questions that we have, but I do want to, I will be putting a link into the chat for anybody who gets the presentation or then is sitting there thinking about something and they have a question. I am going to drop a link into the chat. It's a Google form. You can go on there and ask your questions. This will also be posted on our HPS website. So anybody can go in and ask those questions, and we'll be more than happy to reach back out to you. One thing that I want to say as the family engagement and SGC, oh, we do have one more question. I'm so sorry. Budget is presented to the SGC from the principal. Are the numbers supposed to be shared with parents and not just after the budget has been approved with the board, by the Board of Ed? Yes, that's what Chief Avila touched on before. She did mention that, of course, it is shared with the SGC, and admins will have a PTO parent meeting, and they will share these with the parents. I mean, families, with the families and the school community. So I dropped the link in the chat. I do want to make sure that we are all working together to get all that information that Chief Penn will need to get all those SGC chairs signed up for Allaview. So definitely principals, staff, SGC chairs that are on the call, if you have not reached out to me with your SGC chair name, phone number, and email, please do so we can get that process going. As we have mentioned, we are trying to, we're not trying to, we're having a compressed timeline. So time is of the essence, and it is important that we have this information. As of right now, yep.
One more thing that I wanted to say, you talked about the Google form for submitting questions.
Yes.
Just want to remind folks that as we kind of go through the process, even if you have additional questions, 2 weeks, a month from now, please feel free to put them into that document, because what I like to do is what we've done in the past, and that is to make that a public document so that others can also see the questions and the answers to those. And we also like to have that as a document that continues to be translated as it continues to be populated with questions. Because, the questions that Annie Fisher STEM might have are questions that, I don't know, Burns Latino Studies didn't think about, but that they might find helpful. So we just want to make everyone able to see the questions and the responses. It just allows us to learn from one another.
Yes, no, absolutely. Thank you so much. Are there any emergency funding available?
Emergency funding we only have the recovery funding that we built the budget for and submitted and the state approved. Say more about emergency funding.
Beverly, we have a couple more minutes, so if you can type, let us know what is it. It just says, is there any emergency funding available?
Viviana, it's John.
Okay.
I just want to mention that we also have a live stream going on YouTube, and we had about 10 viewers there as well. So there was a question. I'm not sure if this got answered, but will all SGC members have access to the cloud-based budget dashboard?
That would be the AluView, correct?
Yes, I think that's what they're referring to.
Right. Chief Penn, we're signing up SGC chairs, right? So
Yeah.
they can have access to it. But then they can then share with the SGC members, correct?
I think that's how that process is going to work.
Right.
That's correct.
Right.
I also want to add that I believe the third phase of the AluView was to have one that is like accessible to anyone in the community. I know that's like the last, I know we're not there yet, Chief Penn, because we're building as we go. But if I recall correctly, I think that was going to be like year 2. Year 1, which was last year, where we started to build the program. Year 2, which is this year, principals, school leaders and SGCs. And then year 3, I think, is like anyone in the community can view. Not to the same level of detail, but that there would be a view for community members.
That's awesome. And then last question we have on our Q&A, it's just a curiosity. They're curious to know whether library services or librarians are funded centrally or by school.
Well, I'll be candid and admit I don't know the answer to that, but I will be happy to follow back up with an answer.
Chief Avila, do you know where we stand?
They're funded by school.
School, right? Yeah,
Yes.
because that's a flexibility, if I recall.
Correct.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Great question.
That is a great question. Thank you, families, partners, staff, for joining us tonight. Thank you, Chief Penn and Dr. Torres Rodriguez, for all of this information. Again, this will be shared. You all will have access to it, so you can take a look back at it. The meeting has been recorded, so we'll also share that on. We are going to save this chat because I see that there are some questions coming in, but we are out of time, so we will definitely respond to those questions. So we do save the chat and post them out. If there are any other questions, again, visit that link. It will be posted on our HPS website. And that concludes our budget forum for tonight. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and have a great night.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone. Thank you so much.